Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14 as we continue to follow the 2024 college football season. We're really getting down to it here in the race to get into the college football playoff. Today we'll be going through weeks 10, 11, and 12 as we continue to follow some of these exciting storylines throughout all of the major conferences across the country, and we're going to continue to get answers as the amount of teams left in the playoff race really starts to dwindle down. Last episode, we went through weeks 7, 8, and 9, the middle portion of the season, and there were some surprises for sure. We saw multiple number one ranked teams lose. In week 7, Clemson took their first loss of the year against Navy. Then in week 8, it was Ohio State who got upset by Virginia. And now Middle Tennessee State, the Blue Raiders, are the only undefeated team left in the entire country. They currently occupy the number one spot with a record of 8-0. And we'll be talking about their scenarios for the conference championship and whatnot, along with everybody else here early in today's episode. So for where we stand in terms of the AP poll, we'll take a quick look. Obviously, as I just said, Middle Tennessee State currently holds the number one spot. You've got a lot of the top teams in the SEC up there with Florida, Oklahoma, and Alabama at 2, 3, and 4. Florida State, Clemson, and Miami represent the ACC in the top 10, while Ohio State, USC, and Notre Dame represent the Big Ten. It's very clear those are the three best conferences in the country, and I would be very surprised if when we eventually find out who makes the 12-team college football playoff, I would assume all of the at-large bids will be from the SEC, ACC, or Big Ten. As for the Heisman watch, Georgia quarterback Aaron Ketchikan still holds the top spot, although a number of different players, most notably Duke quarterback Justin Tucker, are really starting to catch up. As we compare guys like Ketchikan and Tucker, I'm not so sure Ketchikan really should be the favorite for the award. I get he plays for a great Georgia team, but Duke has a better record right now than Georgia, and their roster is quite a bit worse. So I would say as of now, Justin Tucker maybe should be higher than 5th place. So now we're going to go through each conference and kind of run down each scenarios for some of the top teams. If you want to skip right to the Week 10 games, I'll put a timestamp in the description for you. But if you want some more context before you get started watching the games, here you go. So as I said just a moment ago, I think the ACC, the Big Ten, and the SEC are the three best teams in the country. And realistically, those conferences are aiming to get 2 or 3 at-large bids, along with, of course, the conference championship winner. And right now in the SEC, I think there's 4 teams clearly in the race. That includes Florida, who is the heavy favorite at the moment to win the SEC East. With their win against Georgia, they are in the driver's seat. All they have to do is beat South Carolina, and they are guaranteed to go to the SEC championship. Their game against Auburn technically doesn't even matter in terms of making the conference championship. All they have to do is beat South Carolina, and they are good. South Carolina is a tough opponent, though. That's not going to be an easy game. And then in the SEC West, it really comes down to Alabama and Oklahoma. Mississippi State still has a slight shot that they have to play against both Bama and Oklahoma in their next 2 games. Oklahoma plays against Alabama in Week 13. I think that game will ultimately decide the winner of that division. The ACC is one big, giant mess. Right now in the Atlantic Division, it's a 3-way race between Florida State, Navy, and Clemson. They all have 1 loss. Florida State plays against Clemson in Week 13, so that's going to be a very pivotal game in terms of that division. And then in the Coastal, it's a 3-way race with Virginia Tech, the only undefeated team in the conference, along with Miami and Duke. Virginia Tech still has to play both of those teams, whereas Duke has already beaten Miami, so those tiebreakers may end up being important when it's all said and done. As for the Big Ten, right now, Notre Dame and Ohio State are lined up to make the conference championship, with Ohio State beating Penn State. They are now in the driver's seat for the Big Ten East, but there are some teams still fighting for positioning. But Ohio State has a pretty easy schedule down the stretch. They don't really play any great teams, so if they win out, they should not only make the conference championship, but cement their spot in the playoff. The Big Ten West is a little more chaotic, with all 4 of these teams fighting to get in the conference championship. Right now, Notre Dame holds their own hand. They play against Navy to start the episode. Not an in-conference game, but still very important. And they still have to play both USC and Oregon. USC already beat Oregon, which is a major bump for them. So the Notre Dame-USC game could ultimately decide who makes the conference championship. In the Big 12, Cincinnati leads the North. They are the only undefeated team in the conference, with Iowa State and Oregon State as their big competition. I think Cincinnati is probably in a good spot to make this conference championship. And then in the South Division, it is just pure chaos. Everybody is within one game with each other. Right now, Baylor and Kansas State are the favorites. I think Baylor's the best team in this division, but who really knows? As for the Pac-12, the Cal Golden Bears are in a good spot. If they win their division, they'll play against one of Arizona, Boise State, and Washington. Arizona still has to play Washington late in the year. That could prove to be a really important game. And then in the South, Cal holds their own fate. They play against Stanford later today in Week 12. So if Cal wins that game, they will pretty much cement their ticket into the conference championship for a second straight year. So Stanford's playoff hopes really ride on them winning that game against Cal in a couple of weeks. I'm very curious to see if Cal can continue to play well with a backup quarterback for most of the rest of the year. Let's now look at the Group 5 conferences, starting with the American. Middle Tennessee State's the only undefeated team left. They have their two toughest games of the season coming up. This week they play against South Florida. Next week they play against Memphis. If Middle Tennessee State wins both of those games, then they'll be 10-0. They'll be pretty much a lock to not only win their division, but make the college football playoff, barring some impressive collapse. So those two games are really important. As for the West, it is a five-way race. Kansas is the highest rated team in the division, but I think South Alabama and Texas Tech will be the two teams to watch. Tulsa leads the Conference USA convincingly. In the MAC, Bowling Green, Akron, and Kent State are all undefeated in conference play, and they are all in the same division. As for the MAC West, Toledo holds a slight lead over Central Michigan and Northern Illinois, so we'll see if the Rockets are able to hold on there. And then Toledo, Georgia State, and UL Lafayette are all undefeated in Sun Belt play. So let's now take a look at the Week 10 slate. There are some pretty big games this week that I'm excited to go over. Some of the notable ones to watch out for include Penn State, Illinois. The Illini are quietly 5-2. Looking down a little further, Baylor and Houston. That game's an important one for conference play. Texas and Kentucky could be interesting. I don't think either team can make a conference championship, but if either of those teams win out, maybe they get an at-large bid. Notre Dame Navy is a big game. Middle Tennessee State, they have to play South Florida. Mississippi State, Oklahoma. Week 11, this slate of games is by far the best of the week. Oregon, Notre Dame, that's a huge matchup. And then looking down the board even further, Virginia Tech and Miami. That's a super big game as well. A big opportunity for both of those teams to prove themselves. Middle Tennessee State, again, they have to play against Memphis. South Carolina and Florida. If the Gators win, they will go to the conference championship. Georgia's got a tough game against Auburn. Alabama, Mississippi State. Maybe Mississippi State is for real. And then Week 12, Duke, Virginia. South Alabama, UCLA is kind of fun. It's not going to affect any conference races, but I guess it's fun. Stanford and Cal, as we talked about, is an important game. And there may be some other games that end up being more important once we get into Week 12. We'll start with Penn State in Illinois. The Nittany Lions just lost to Ohio State last week. And both of these teams are currently a little bit behind the Buckeyes in the Big Ten East Division. So both of these teams could really use a win here. They can't really afford another loss if they want another shot at the playoff. Well, on the first play of the game, Illinois got a pick six from cornerback Lancelot McAdeer to put them in the driver's seat from the start. And although Penn State really stayed in the game the entire time, I think that pick six really gave Illinois a lot of momentum. And from there, the Illini really never let go of the driver's seat. Illinois played really well throughout this game, and they were ultimately able to upset Penn State in this matchup, really posing the question of, can Illinois be a team who possibly makes a college football playoff run? They're 6-2. They still have to play Ohio State later in the year. That's going to prove to be a very important game. I think they're going to have to win that one if they want any chance of getting in. But it's certainly possible, as they would win this one 41-38. Derek Watson, the junior quarterback, is a really talented player. Andre Antavius is one of the best running backs in the country. Tyler Kane out wide is really good too. Lennon Kirkstead played well for Penn State, but ultimately not enough to get the job done and grab the victory. Next up, we'll be looking at number 2, Virginia. They had a busy episode last time around, including beating number 1 Ohio State. They'll face off against Georgia Tech. If Virginia wants any real shot of making the playoff, they have to win out. And, well, they ended up not winning this game. Georgia Tech took care of business. The Yellow Jackets are playing a lot better than they did last year. This series has been a major roller coaster for Georgia Tech after winning the ACC in year one. Last year, they didn't even make a bowl game. This year, they look a lot more respectable, and they dominated today, 45-14, a massive win over the University of Virginia. Big win for Georgia Tech. Try to get some momentum and make a bowl game. They're not going to make a playoff run or anything, but if they can win 7 or 8 games and win a bowl game this year, then I think they can really put their program in a good spot. Number 4, Alabama returns home as they are set to face off against Louisiana Tech. This should be an easy game for Alabama. No issues, no problemo. Well, not so fast. Louisiana Tech really gave them a run for their money. This game ended up being really close. I think the weather certainly played a factor. The conditions were ugly. It was super rainy, super wet, and both offenses had a lot of trouble moving the ball, and ultimately ended up being a major defensive battle. Ultimately, Alabama would get the ball late in the game with an opportunity to win, and they knew they had to win this game or else they would be laughed at by the college football community, and they were able to just barely survive against Louisiana Tech, 22-17. Alabama holds their ranking, although, to be honest, maybe they should have dropped a couple of spots. It's not like Louisiana Tech's any good. Alabama ran the ball well, but Troy Davenport didn't really perform well. Their defense performed well. Jubal Chantel, the sophomore defensive end, had 7 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. That's pretty good, if you ask me. Number 18, Baylor faces off against the Houston Cougars. If Houston wants any slight chance to win this division, they have to win this game here against the Baylor Bears, who look like the favorites to win the Big 12 South as of now. And, well, Baylor completely dominated. Dontavius Brown, the sophomore running back, continues to impose his will on defenses, and this game ended up being a total blowout as Baylor would win 35-6. A statement win here for Baylor, and I get Houston's not the greatest team in the world. Baylor decided to start a different quarterback today, Devin Siegel. They're mixing things up, and Siegel ended up actually playing really well, not just as a passer, but also as a runner. As for Houston, they're 3-5. It's really a shame. They've gone downhill really quickly after making the college football playoff just a season ago. Number 25, Texas, faces off against number 24, Kentucky. Both teams have 3 losses. That's really the cutoff for getting an at-large bid into the playoff. So if either of these teams want any miraculous shot to make the playoff, they not only have to win this game, but they have to win out. It ended up being a pretty close matchup as Onyx St. James continues to play pretty well for the Texas Longhorns, and his performance today would ultimately be enough to win over Kentucky, despite a very strong performance from sophomore running back Fadiala Cisse, who continues to be one of the bright stars of college football. Texas would win 42-35, and Texas is in a really interesting spot right now because they're 6-3. They're the 20th ranked team in the country. I think there is a path for them to get into the college football playoff. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Texas might actually be back. Onyx St. James had a very Onyx St. James-esque performance. He was inefficient, but he threw for a lot of touchdowns. He makes a lot of big throws, so he's kind of a confusing player, but he makes it work. As we look at Texas's schedule, it's pretty easy down the stretch. Texas A&M sucks, Arkansas should be a competitive game, and Ole Miss sucks. So if Texas wins out, they'll finish the season 9-3, and they'll have a real shot to get an at-large bid. The problem is they don't have any statement wins. They've played against 3 ranked teams, all of which were close losses, and other than the Kentucky win, Texas's wins are all by more than 1 score. So they have a real interesting case if they win out. Knowing Texas, they'll probably lose to either A&M or Ole Miss, and we'll be able to laugh at them again. Notre Dame and Navy is up next. This is one of our Discord Pick'em games of the week. Notre Dame getting around 63% of the vote. The vote is pretty close, and it's not really a surprise because these 2 teams are pretty evenly matched. They're 2 very similar offenses. They're option-styled. Both teams love to run the ball. Neither teams have great passing attacks. So since both of these are very similar offenses, the 2 defenses knew exactly how to game plan. So because of that, this ended up being a really low-scoring game. Notre Dame ran the ball well with M.J. Hill, their fantastic senior running back, as did Navy with Torian Wilson, another fantastic player. It ended up being really close, but ultimately a late touchdown from Torian Wilson would be enough for Navy to get the win over Notre Dame, 24-20. This is a huge win for Navy, really showing that they are one of the better teams in the country, and they have a real case to make the college football playoff. Navy's got some tough in-conference games left in the ACC, but they make a real case to get in. As for Notre Dame, this gives them less margin for error, but it doesn't affect their in-conference record. Middle Tennessee State, the number 1 ranked team, plays against USF. Just to put into context how good Middle Tennessee State is, they have the number 1 scoring offense, the number 1 scoring defense, and they're ranked very highly in other major statistical categories. These guys have been the best team in the country this year, but they have their 2 toughest games up next, starting with the University of South Florida. The Bulls are 5-2. They score 36.1 points per game, and they allow 36.1 points per game. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be, but don't let the point differential deceive you. They are a really good team, and South Florida ended up making this game a battle. A lot of people thought Middle Tennessee State would just blow these guys out of the water, but South Florida is a really, really tough opponent, and they gave them everything they got today. But Middle Tennessee State's a little bit too good, and they would avoid the upset bid over South Florida, as the Blue Raiders would hold their number 1 ranking with the win here over USF. Middle Tennessee State is now 9-0. As long as they beat Memphis next week, I think they should be able to make the playoff as they win this game 38-21. Donovan Ferguson with the most Onyx St. James-esque stat line ever. Low completion percentage, but a lot of touchdowns. Drain Ignatius played really well. Middle Tennessee State's been without their main running back, Barrington Britt, for most of the year with an injury. The backup, Taquan Pugh, has done a great job in his place. Mississippi State and Oklahoma is up next, another pick'em game of the week. A lot of people think Oklahoma's going to win, and going into this game, I expected Oklahoma to completely mop the floor on these guys, and, well, Oklahoma ended up completely mopping the floor on these guys. It was not even close. Romeo Coloci and the Sooners completely dominated, and my suspicions of Mississippi State not really being all that good ended up being correct. I never really took Mississippi State seriously in the SEC race. I always felt like it was between Oklahoma and Alabama in the SEC West, and Oklahoma proved today not just that they're better than Mississippi State, but I think Oklahoma has the slight edge over Alabama. Romeo Coloci with a quiet game for his standards. Running back Tyshawn Bankston was really the star of the show with 3 touchdowns and almost 150 total yards of offense. Win Quinton did not perform well here in the loss for Mississippi State as they fall to 6-3. They've got to beat Alabama next week, or any chance they had of making the playoff is done. Number 5 Florida State faces off against the 1-7 LSU Tigers. Yeah, LSU is not very good. This should be an easy win for Florida State, and it wasn't exactly easy. LSU made this game pretty competitive. That was a nice touchdown run by the senior, Joely Iglesias. Florida State was able to avoid the upset bid, winning 28-18. But this is a little bit concerning for FSU, only beating LSU by 10 points. Florida State's got some really tough games these next few weeks. Obviously, Clemson in Week 13 is going to be a big one. So Florida State's got to prove themselves, because the last couple of years they have looked like they're going to make the college football playoff at the end of the season. They lose a couple games down the stretch, and they end up missing out. They can't let that happen again, and although they won today, I don't really think they helped their stock, per se. Next up, we've got Washington and Boise State on the blue turf. Boise State has a slight shot of winning their division, but in order to do that, they have to win this game today here against Washington. It ended up being a very high-scoring, offensive, octane battle. Boise State's senior wide receiver, Kevin Shasha Jr., has been completely carrying the offense these last couple of weeks. Going into the year, Shasha wasn't really on anybody's draft radar, but he's now looking like a possible 3rd or 4th round pick with how he's playing. But as good as he was, Washington's offense was just as good. Wide receiver Racer Fox scored 4 touchdowns today, leading the Huskies to the victory over the Boise State Broncos 45-42 in a high-scoring offensive thriller. Skipper Lansdale threw 5 touchdowns for the Broncos, but it was not enough to get the win. And the aforementioned Kevin Shasha Jr. with 185 on 8 catches for 2 scores. He played out of his mind. As for Washington, Kai Suggs-Gardner with one of the best games of his career, throwing 6 touchdowns. So Washington pretty much has to beat Arizona in Week 13. If they do, they'll probably go to the Pac-12 championship. And the final game of this week, we've got Auburn facing off against number 2 Florida. The Gators are in a good spot. As long as they win next week, they will make the SEC championship. Like, they want to give themselves as much margin for error as possible, so obviously they want to make sure they win this game. Auburn looked really good early. They led 14-0 after the first quarter, and it really looked like a trap game early on for Florida, who might have been looking ahead a little bit to the South Carolina game next week. But after the first quarter, Florida flipped a switch. Ernie Capellar played out of his mind as he continues to have a Heisman-esque season. Tight end Brandon Pickens would continue to improve his draft stock, scoring twice. And while we're on the topic of draft stock, there are some real conversations around the NFL right now talking about Florida quarterback Ernie Capellar, not just as a first-rounder, but potentially as the number one quarterback off the board. There are some scouts who really, really like him, and he continues to play well this year as Florida would win 35-27, holding their number 2 ranking in the AP poll, led by a 5-touchdown performance from Ernie Capellar. Brandon Pickens and Chris Gentry each caught 2 scores apiece as the Gators are now 8-1. Florida's got some tough games down the stretch. Obviously, we've talked about the South Carolina game next week. That's Florida's final in-conference game, and if they win that, they will go to the conference championship no matter what. So as we look at the scores from some of the other games, USC and Oregon take care of business. Duke beats Maryland 45-35. Virginia Tech with a good win over the struggling Boston College Eagles. Michigan is back in the top 25 as they beat the Michigan State Spartans. Clemson with a solid win over Wake Forest. Going down the board even further now, we've got Ohio State taking care of business against Pitt. Arizona with a close win over Fresno State. And then some of the other later games, South Carolina puts up 56 on UMass, Cal with a solid win. And then for some of the non-top 25 games, Army beats their rival Air Force. Stanford snaps their 3-game losing streak, beating Colorado. So that Stanford and Cal game in Week 12 looks like it will end up being really important. Minnesota with a solid win. Wisconsin upsets UCLA. NC State beats North Carolina as the Tar Heels continue to have a really disappointing season. I expected a lot more out of them. Ole Miss beats Texas A&M in the Trash Bowl. Both of those teams suck. South Alabama with a big win over Tulane. West Virginia blows out the struggling Missouri Tigers, who have lost a number of games in a row. UAB defeats Kansas. Eastern Michigan's one of the hottest teams in the MAC. They win once again. Memphis loses to UConn, an upset against the Tigers. Washington State wins. That's a rarity. Central Michigan blows out Toledo. Big win for the Chippewas. Akron remains undefeated in conference play. UCF with a good win over Kansas State. And BYU upsets Oregon State in overtime. So as we look at the top 25 polls, there's not a whole lot of movement at the top. There weren't many super big upsets this week, so the top 9 stays exactly the same. With Notre Dame losing, they will go down a few spots. Georgia jumps up 1. Navy leapfrogs a few teams. They are now number 11, jumping both Oregon and Duke. Notre Dame drops to number 16. Texas goes up 5. Illinois, Michigan, and Arizona are now ranked, with UCLA, Virginia, and Kentucky dropping out. As for the Heisman race, Aaron Ketchikan remains in first place for Georgia. The only change is Cedric Chapman of Clemson, now in 4th place. I mean, how can one say Cedric Chapman's passing numbers are better than Justin Tucker? I get Chapman had like 500 total yards of offense against Wake Forest, but still, make it make sense. Jardis Gill of Wisconsin wins the Defensive Player of the Week, while South Alabama quarterback Kujay Reddings wins it for offense. Now that we're in Week 11, we can get a look at some of the award semifinalists, not just the Heisman Trophy. We get to see all of them now. Obviously, at the end of the year, along with you guys voting for who makes the college football playoff, you guys also get to vote for the awards, including the Heisman Trophy, along with all of the awards here. We'll obviously talk about that once we get later into the season, but these are some of the favorites currently for all of the big-time awards, with 5 more weeks left to go in the season, and most teams having 3 or 4 games left on their schedule. So as we look at Week 11, as I said earlier today, this is the most important week of today's episode. Oregon and Notre Dame is a huge matchup within the Big Ten. Michigan and TCU, that game would have been really fun like last year. Penn State and Pitt is quietly important. Virginia Tech and Miami is unquietly very important. Memphis and Middle Tennessee State, we talked about that game for the Blue Raiders. South Carolina, Florida, of course, if the Gators win, they are in the SEC Championship no matter what. Georgia's got a tough game. Arizona's got a tough game. USC has a tough game. So it'll be interesting to see how all of these teams end up playing. We'll start off Week 11 with maybe the most important game of the week. Oregon and Notre Dame, and it seems like the pick'em really likes Oregon in this matchup, getting 2/3 of the votes. This is a huge matchup within the Big Ten landscape, and in terms of getting an at-large bid, both of these teams can't really afford to lose. They're already at 2 losses, so they both don't want to add a third. This game ended up being kind of back and forth, with Notre Dame rocking their green jerseys in this one. In the first quarter, it was all about the Irish. They led 14-0. Then Oregon scored 21 unanswered in the second to take a halftime lead. In the third quarter, it was back to Notre Dame and back to running back M.J. Hill, who again ran over this Oregon defense. But in the fourth quarter, when the lights shined the brightest and one of these teams needed to make plays, that team was the Oregon Ducks, and they were able to get this big victory on the road against Notre Dame, 42-35. The Irish are starting to look a little bit fraudulent. They go 0-2 to start today's episode, and they now have no more margin for error. Unless they win out, I don't think they are getting in the playoff. Baz Boyd had probably the weirdest stat line you'll ever see. 11 for 18, 97 yards, and 4 passing touchdowns. I mean, he made it work, I guess, despite not winning the game. Barrett Cherokee with a huge performance for the Ducks. Oregon only has 2 more games left, and they're both pretty easy. So if they win those 2, they'll finish 10-2. Probably won't make the conference championship, but I think that'll be good enough for the Ducks to get an at-large bid. Number 23, Michigan heads to TCU to face off against the Horned Frogs. Both of these teams technically have slight chances to win their divisions, but it's not looking good. These are 2 very exciting teams, at least in the past. And sure enough, today's game ended up being really fun. Michigan quarterback Callaghan October had probably the best performance of his career, but TCU quarterback Tegan Yeager was just as good. This game ultimately went down to the wire between a couple of national championship contenders from last year. Obviously, TCU ended up winning the damn thing. And TCU ended up winning today despite a great performance from Callaghan October in which he went 20 for 25. But it was Tegan Yeager who got the last laugh, leading the Horned Frogs to the win. Michigan's stay in the top 25 is going to be a short one as they will immediately drop back out. Any chance Michigan had has been dead for a while now, and the same can be said here for TCU with both teams sitting at 4 losses. Tegan Yeager, 25-35, 278 and 3 touchdowns, and in October, 20 of 25, 343 and 5. Both of these teams have bright futures because they have 2 talented quarterbacks, but this just wasn't their year. Number 21, Penn State faces off against their rival Pitt in the snow, our first snow game of the year. One of the fun storylines about Pitt being in the Big Ten is that these 2 teams get to play against each other every year. What was once a really fun rivalry in college football has been kind of destroyed, but now it's back. Both teams kind of need to win this game if they want any slight shot of winning the Big Ten East, and it was Pitt who would end up getting the upset here over Penn State. The Nittany Lions lose their first 2 games of the episode, and any slight shot they had of making the playoff has now been flushed down the toilet pretty much. Pitt is a really fun story. They started the year off 0-3, but they're 6-1 since then, with their lone loss coming back in Week 10, last week, against Ohio State. Next up, we've got Virginia Tech and Miami. This is a huge game in the ACC landscape. The Pick'em really likes Miami, getting around 73% of the vote. Well, I think the Pick'em is in for a little bit of a surprise based on what happened in the first half. Virginia Tech, in half number 1, not only looked like the better team, they didn't just look like a college football playoff contender, but they looked like a team who can win the national championship. After the first half, Virginia Tech led 38-0. I did not stutter. Virginia Tech led 38-0. And then in the second half, Miami made a quarterback change. Luke Burnett was placed into the lineup, and Miami stormed back. By the time we got to the 5-minute mark in the fourth quarter, it was just a 10-point game. Virginia Tech's lead diminished to 38-28, but ultimately Miami did not have enough time to finish off the comeback. This onside kick recovery by Virginia Tech, along with 5 minutes of chewing clock, would be enough to win the game. So Virginia Tech survives. Huge win for the Hokies. They're 8-1. They're in the top 10. They're still undefeated in conference. But I don't really know how to feel about this game, because in the first half, Virginia Tech looked like they could win a national championship, and in the second half, they looked horrible. As for Miami, the fascinating storyline here is the quarterback change with Luke Burnett, who played fine, stay in the starting lineup as opposed to Scooter Young Jr. Number 5, Florida State heads to the Carrier Dome to face off against a tough Syracuse team. This is a game Florida State should win, but the Orange are no slouch, and Florida State had to learn that the hard way because Syracuse came to play in this matchup. Florida State led at the half, but Syracuse dominated in the third quarter, and that was enough for the Orange to get the upset win over Florida State, 38-26. The issue with Florida State is every year they're in the top part of the rankings, close to the end of the season, and they lose a couple games they shouldn't to knock them out of playoff contention. And I'm worried that's going to happen with Florida State again because they still have to play Clemson and they still have to play Florida. This was not a game they could afford to lose, so now the Seminoles are in a little bit of trouble with their final 3 games on tap. Number 7, Clemson faces off against NC State. The Wolfpack are a pretty solid team. They have been improving throughout the last couple of seasons. As for Clemson, they have been, coasting along. They lost a game early, but they've been solid this year, and Clemson would get another solid win today. I don't really know what to think about Clemson because the whole year I've been worried about them looking fraudulent and dropping games they shouldn't have. But that hasn't really been the case with Clemson. Their only loss this year was on the road against Navy, who, as we've seen, is really good, and they lost that game by 3. I think Clemson's big test is going to be in 2 weeks when they play against Florida State, another team who's currently on fraud watch, but it really looks like Clemson is good enough to not just make the playoff, but make a run. Next up, we have Oklahoma headed down to Knoxville to face off against the Tennessee Volunteers. On paper, this should be a pretty easy game for Oklahoma, and although Tennessee's a good team, Oklahoma should win. And early on, Oklahoma was playing well. Romeo Colucci got off to a good start. However, late in the first quarter, Colucci ended up getting injured. Not a serious injury. He'll be fine going forward, but after this play where he got yanked to the ground, he would have to miss the rest of the game. The backup quarterback, Deacon Adderley, who is going to be Oklahoma's starter next year, ended up playing pretty well. However, once Colucci got hurt, it felt like Oklahoma kind of lost their edge, and Tennessee took total advantage. Benjamin McKenzie, the Tennessee quarterback, made some big-time throws in the fourth quarter of this game, and ultimately Tennessee was able to get the upset over the Oklahoma Sooners, a massive win for Tennessee, who's been inconsistent this year, but they've beaten some really, really good opponents, and they beat another one here in the Sooners. I'm not too worried about Oklahoma. They did lose 3 games last year. Chances are their matchup against Alabama will still determine the winner of the SEC West, and Oklahoma has a great argument to get an at-large bid regardless. So if I'm Oklahoma, I wouldn't be hitting the panic button, especially with Colucci returning next week. Number 1, Middle Tennessee State has their toughest test left. They face off against Memphis here, and it seems like a lot of people wanted to pick the sexy upset, being the Memphis Tigers, who were 12.5-point underdogs. Throughout the first 3 quarters of this game, it was actually a really close matchup. Memphis absolutely was up for the task today, and this ended up being a really good game. Middle Tennessee State's offense has been really good the last couple of weeks, but their defense has been exposed by 2 strong offenses in South Florida and Memphis. Going into the fourth quarter, this game was neck and neck, and ultimately somebody had to take control, and that team would end up being Middle Tennessee State. The Blue Raiders would hold on to win, although Memphis did cover the spread, so good for them. But Middle Tennessee State would win. They remain number 1. They are now 10-0, and it looks like Middle Tennessee State has a clear path ahead of them to the college football playoff after their win today here against a really good Memphis Tigers team. With Middle Tennessee State winning their last 2 games close, this game they only won by 8, the Blue Raiders did look a little bit vulnerable, but with Drain Ignatius throwing for 5 touchdowns and Barrington Britt being back in the lineup, there's a lot of reason to be excited about Middle Tennessee's chances of winning the national title after falling just short the last 2 seasons. All right, this is a huge game for Florida. If they win, they are going to the SEC Championship no matter what. This is their final in-conference game. They'll have the tiebreakers over both South Carolina and Georgia. They'll have a better record than South Carolina and Georgia. And, well, Ernie Capellar was up to the task. And with that, Florida has punched their ticket into the SEC Championship for the first time in this series. We've had a different representative out of the SEC East all 3 years. In Season 1, it was Georgia, who beat Oklahoma. In Season 2, it was Kentucky, who lost to Oklahoma. And now it's Florida, who's going to play either Oklahoma or Alabama. Ernie Capellar balled out again. I think unless Florida loses out, it would take a long shot for them not to make the playoff at this point. Shout out to South Carolina on a good season, but I think their Cinderella hopes are over. Maybe things would have been different if quarterback Marco Prince never got injured. So with Florida advancing to the SEC championship, the only way Georgia can get into the college football playoff is with an at-large bid. Realistically, they can't really lose many, if any, more games if they want to get in. So every game for the Bulldogs is now a must-win. This game against Auburn ended up being really close. Auburn gave Florida a tough match last week. They gave Georgia a tough match this week. But ultimately, the Bulldogs would survive. They would get the win over Auburn. Georgia is now 8-2 with 2 games left to go. Their schedule isn't too hard, and I think they should be able to win both games. If they do, they'll position themselves well to get an at-large bid into the college football playoff. And if they lose one of those 2 games, then who knows? So they're certainly in an interesting spot. Aaron Ketchikan played very well again as he continues to have a Heisman-esque season, and his draft stock continues to rise. Monty Grant had a big game in the air. As for Auburn, Jet Jackson was fine, but not able to get the win as the Tigers fall to a 500 record. Next up, we will be headed down to Arizona. This is a non-conference game, but it would be nice to see Arizona play well at the end of the season for once, because the last couple of years they've positioned themselves well to make the Pac-12 championship and blew it. This isn't an in-conference game, but it would still be nice to win. However, Arizona has not had to play against a guy like Cannon McMullen yet. McMullen completely ran through the Arizona defense, continuing to show why he's going to be the first running back off the board in this year's draft, and a very possible first-round pick as Arkansas wins 35-31, knocking the Wildcats out of the top 25 rankings. Kareem Kamara did not play well. That's not an encouraging sign with Arizona having to play Washington in a couple of weeks to most likely decide their division in the Pac-12. As for Arkansas, Josiah Farrell was fine, but Cannon McMullen was the big story, along with Raheem Rocket Jr. The 2 of them combined for nearly 300 rushing yards. Number 9, USC faces off against Stanford. USC needs to win as many games as possible. They would love to assure that they're going to get at least an at-large bid into the college football playoff, so they can't really afford to lose. Both teams threw the ball horribly. There were 7 total interceptions, so it was really down to the run games, which team would run the ball better. And ultimately, that team would be the Stanford Cardinal and Rudolph Moore, who had 2 late touchdowns to propel Stanford to the upset win, 27-20 in overtime. So Stanford is now 8-3. They have 1 more game left. That's next week against Cal. If Stanford wins, they have the shot to make the conference championship. And if they lose, it's all over for the Cardinals. As for USC, they dropped to 15. They still have a great shot to make the college football playoff. This doesn't affect their standing within the Big Ten, but it gives them less margin for error in terms of getting an at-large bid. Scotty Kimbrell usually has 1 game a year where he throws a bunch of interceptions, and, well, today was that game. Notable performers on defense include Gladen Bichelli, who had 2 interceptions for Stanford, and Cheetah Abdelani, who had 3 for the USC defense. The final game of the week, we've got number 4, Alabama, coming off a very close win against Louisiana Tech, and in Mississippi State, who got blown out last week against Oklahoma. Mississippi State pulled out all the stops. They had their backup quarterback, Ryan Gay, out as a receiver on this play. He caught a super long touchdown. The Bulldogs gave it all they got, and it ended up being a really close game. But ultimately, Alabama was just a little bit too good. The Crimson Tide would win 24-21. It really feels like Alabama's just coasting along. They're winning a lot of close games. Alabama has a bye week in Week 12, and then in the next episode, they play Oklahoma and Auburn. If Alabama wins at least one of those games, particularly the Oklahoma one, they should get into the college football playoff. But I just don't fully trust Alabama, even though they have not lost since all the way back in Week 2, their first game of the year. As we take a look at some of the other scores, Cincinnati is now ranked as they beat Oregon State 49-33. Duke drops 55. Baylor demolishes UCF. It's looking more and more likely Baylor will make the conference championship. Navy wins in a blowout over Wake Forest. The Midshipmen really look like a contender here for the playoff. Ohio State and Illinois take care of business. Cal with another win. They beat Colorado 35-24. Washington demolishes Utah, and then Texas barely beats Texas A&M. If they would have lost that game, that would have been kind of hilarious. Rice beats Kansas. Any slim shot the Jayhawks had of making the conference championship is now dead. Fresno State's a good team. They're 6-3, first year of a new head coach. Tulsa now 8-2. Nebraska finally wins an in-conference game, beating Northwestern. Virginia barely beats Boston College. Shouldn't be beating them by 3, but okay. Central Michigan lost 31-0 against 2-7 Western Michigan. It appears Central Michigan is kind of falling off a little bit. They are not playing good football. It does not look like they'll make the conference championship. South Alabama drops 52, while USF drops 56. Minnesota with a nice win over West Virginia. Iowa with a nice win over Wisconsin. Idaho is now 9-1 within the Mountain West as they beat BYU. Boise State over Washington State. Kansas State over Houston in overtime. Bowling Green now 8-1, 6-0 in conference, while Texas Tech continues to win as they look to get into the American Athletic Conference Championship game and potentially spoil the fun for Middle Tennessee State. So this week we do have a lot of movement within the AP poll. Plenty of teams moving up and down. The biggest movers at the top include Oklahoma and Florida State and Miami. That's 3 top 10 teams who lost this week, meaning teams like Georgia, Oregon, Navy, and Virginia Tech are all jumping up into the top 10. Along with that, teams like Duke and Baylor get to go up with the benefit of Miami, Florida State, and USC losing. So that's 4 top 10 teams, losing this week. As for some of the other movers, Tennessee, Stanford, and Cincinnati, along with Virginia, are now ranked, while we have 4 teams out of the poll, those being Penn State, Michigan, Mississippi State, and Arizona. As we look at the Heisman race, again, not a whole lot of changes. There is more movement than last week, however. Currently, Aram Kachakan is still in first. Ernie Capellar jumps up to 2, jumping Darius Coley, while Justin Tucker and Barrett Cherokee move up to 4 and 5. And Cedric Chapman stay on the Heisman watch. Ends up being pretty short-lived, as it really should be. Players of the week on defense, it's USC corner Cheetah Abdelaney with 3 interceptions. And on offense, it's Florida quarterback Ernie Capellar, who has now cemented himself well within the Heisman race. Let's take a look at the Week 12 games. We saw Syracuse beat Florida State. Maybe they can do it again against Clemson. Duke has a tough matchup against Virginia. We'll see if Justin Tucker can keep things rolling. Stanford and Cal, we've talked about how important that game is for both of those teams. Stanford's playoff hopes really ride on what happens in that matchup. And then Miami, UNC. Miami's got to win. We'll see what they do at quarterback. Texas has to win against Arkansas. So we'll start things off with Cincinnati. The Bearcats are undefeated in conference play. It really looks like they're going to make the conference championship, and if they win, then they will go to the college football playoff. Cincinnati's a really good team. They're balanced on both sides of the ball. Today was about their defense, although their offense did make some plays. Quarterback Seth Maddox did not have his best performance. He threw 3 interceptions and wasn't really all that efficient. But it didn't matter because the rest of Cincinnati really stepped up. When everybody on this team is on, they can beat just about anybody. Cincinnati's only losses are to good teams by very close margins. So I think Cincinnati can absolutely make some noise in the college football playoff if they were to advance to the conference championship and win against most likely Baylor. As for West Virginia, they fall to 5 and 5. It's a shame they've become mediocre since season 1 when they won the Big 12 and would have made the playoff if we had a 12-team system then. Number 5, Clemson faces off against the Syracuse Orange. Syracuse just beat Florida last week. Clemson's got a tough task ahead of them here today. And if they want to continue to avoid the fraud conversation, then they're going to need to win this game. It ended up being a pretty close matchup. Syracuse gave it everything they had, but ultimately Clemson was a little bit too good. The Tigers would squeak away with another win. I don't know if I feel even more good about them because they keep winning, or worse about them because they keep winning in such close games. I think next week's matchup against Florida State is really going to be the test for Clemson, although Questo Chigolomoklo was pretty damn good today with 200 yards and 4 touchdowns. Got to give him credit because he balled out for the Tigers. Kylo Threes was really good for Syracuse. He threw for 4 scores, but was not quite able to get Syracuse the win. Next up, we have Duke and Virginia, one of our pick'em games of the week. Everybody seems to like Duke in this matchup, which is not really a surprise because Duke has arguably the best player in the country. This ended up being probably the best game of the week. Two talented offenses going back and forth. Virginia quarterback George Eddy was really solid in this game as he had some really nice touchdowns, particularly to his tight end Thompson. On the other side, we saw the Justin Tucker and Jabari Kruger connection continue to light up the field, and hopefully these two guys are maybe going to get the opportunity to do so in the ACC Championship or in the College Football Playoff. This game ultimately went down to the wire into overtime, but ultimately one of these teams has Justin Tucker and the other one doesn't, and that ultimately ended up being the difference today. Duke ends up beating Virginia by 7, 42-35. Duke still only has one loss this year. They play against Virginia Tech next week, who also currently has one loss, so that's going to be a huge test for the Blue Devils. George Eddy threw for 5 touchdowns. He was great. On the other side, Justin Tucker with a pretty normal game for his standards. Just a regular day in the park for Justin Tucker, throwing for nearly 400 yards and 5 touchdowns. Number 4, the Ohio State heads back to the shoe to face off against Indiana. The Hoosiers had high expectations this year, and things just haven't really worked out. And today, well, once again, things did not exactly work out for the Hoosiers. Ohio State has had a really easy schedule these last few weeks, and they have taken total advantage. There have been no hiccups from the Buckeyes as they have been able to steamroll through their opponents and are now 9-1. Ohio State's schedule does get a little tougher these last 2 weeks. They play against Illinois in Week 13, and the Fighting Illini are about as red hot as anyone is right now. And then Week 14, of course, they play against their rival, Michigan. So things could get tough for the Buckeyes, but I think unless they lose out, they'll probably make the playoff. Next up, we got Stanford and Cal. If Cal wins, they are 100% going to the Pac-12 championship. Even if Stanford wins this game, Cal is still in the driver's seat, but they need some things to happen. The Pick'em seems to really like Stanford, so naturally the Pick'em is going to get the game wrong. Cal would end up winning and officially punching their ticket into the conference championship. This entire Cal season has been one hell of a roller coaster, but the Golden Bears are now 9-1. They've won 9 in a row, mostly with a backup quarterback. So they continue to just be really fascinating, and Marquise Harris, the backup quarterback, continues to play phenomenal football. If you look at Cal's schedule, they have not lost to an FBS team all year. They got embarrassed in Week 2 to FCS Northwest, but they haven't lost since then, and their schedule the rest of the year is pretty easy. Another fascinating storyline for them is when Rufus Motley gets back, does he remain the starting quarterback? Because Marquise Harris, who I said they should not have turned to, has been unbelievable. He has 19 touchdowns and 0 interceptions and a 70% completion percentage, whereas Motley's been a lot worse as a passer. Obviously, he gives you more as a runner, but it's an interesting dilemma Cal has. Speaking of quarterback dilemmas, Miami just benched Scooter Young last week, but it was actually injury, not because of performance. Scooter Young broke his tailbone. He'll be out 8 weeks. So Luke Burnett will be the starting quarterback for Miami for pretty much the rest of the year. And although Scooter Young has his flaws, this team, they kind of lost their spunk with him not in the lineup. The struggling North Carolina Tar Heels were able to get a nice win here over Miami, and it seems like any chance the Hurricanes had of making the college football playoff has unraveled these last couple of weeks with their quarterback getting hurt and then losing their last 2 games. This one they fall 42-21. Graham Fisher played well for the Tar Heels as his senior season comes to a close in a couple of games. Still a very disappointing season for UNC. I expected them to be a lot better, but a good win here down the stretch against Miami. The last game of the day, we've got Arkansas and Texas. Sound the alarms because I think it's time. The Texas Longhorns are back. I can't believe I'm saying that, but Texas has a legitimate case for the college football playoff, and they proved that today. Onyx St. James had a nice performance. True freshman wide receiver Tayon Keon played really well. I feel like some of you guys are waiting for me to say just kidding, but it's not a joke. Texas actually won this game, and it looks like they could legitimately hop into the college football playoff. They're now 8-3. Their last game of the season is against Ole Miss, and Ole Miss sucks. So Texas should win that game, go up to 9-3, and they will have a legitimate case to get an at-large bid into the college football playoff. Again, I cannot believe I'm saying that, but yeah, shout out to Texas. This year they had no expectations, and fittingly, this is the year that they do well, whereas the last couple of seasons, when they start in the preseason top 10, they play horribly. There were not a ton of games went over this week because naturally there weren't a ton of interesting games. I think week 13 is really where we're going to see a bunch of interesting matchups. There weren't many notable highly ranked teams who lost this week other than, I guess, Miami. And Miami was kind of already falling anyway with their starting quarterback, Scooter Young, getting injured. So here are the rest of the scores, and then as we look at the non-top 25 games, again, nothing overly surprising or notable. But as we get to the last few weeks, there are some huge matchups that I'm really excited to talk about as we get closer to the end of today's episode. And I'm really considering giving Week 13 its own episode because as you guys are going to see in a couple of minutes when we preview the next couple of weeks, the Week 13 slate is insane. There are like 4 or 5 legitimately huge games that are going to impact the college football playoff. They're going to impact the rest of the season. So it's like Week 12 decided to be really bad just to save all of the craziness for Week 13. So I have the feeling next week, and really the last 3 weeks as a whole, but next week in particular, is just going to be absolutely crazy. Some other notable results that I kind of skipped through here, including Penn State beating Michigan. Georgia Tech lost to Boston College. That's kind of embarrassing. Tennessee dropped 55 on Vanderbilt. That's a lot. Utah State was favored to win the Mountain West at the beginning of the year. They are now 0-9. Speaking of teams favored to win their conference, Central Michigan lost to Eastern Michigan. So Central Michigan's probably not going to make it back to the conference championship. The top of the poll stays exactly the same. There's no movement because nobody really good lost this week. So the top 11 stays the same, with the big dropper being Miami, falling all the way to 25. USF and South Alabama are now ranked. Stanford and Virginia drop out. The Heisman Watch, we finally have a lot of movement, so let's talk about it. Aaron Katchikan has fallen all the way to 4th, with Ernie Capellar in 1st, Justin Tucker in 2nd, Barrett Cherokee in 3rd, and Puma Whitlock now in the top 5. As for your players of the week, Casey Montgomery for Georgia State had 9 tackles for loss, and on offense, it's Penn State quarterback Lyndon Kirkstead. So with 3 more weeks to go, we're going to quickly update everybody on the current standings and where each conference sits while previewing some of the super exciting games that I'm really excited to go over in the next episode. We'll start with the SEC. The Florida Gators have already clinched their division. Unless Florida loses out, and even if they do, it would be against Florida State and whoever they play in the SEC championship. So even if Florida does lose out, they'll probably get in the playoff unless they lose out embarrassingly. As for the West, Alabama plays Oklahoma. Winner goes to the SEC championship, while the loser is going to need to hope for an at-large bid. I think Oklahoma's a little bit better than Alabama, but Oklahoma also has less margin for error since they lost today to Tennessee. Georgia, I think, has a good shot at an at-large bid, and as I said, maybe Texas as well. The ACC has been the most chaotic and honestly the best conference in the country this year. In the Atlantic, Navy controls their own fate, while Florida State is barely hanging on by a thread. They lost to Syracuse today, and they still have to play Clemson in Florida. Navy has 2 more easy games left, so Navy should win this division and make the conference championship with Clemson and Florida State vying for at-large bids. Florida State, if they win both of their last 2 games, I think they're in. If they don't, then I honestly think they're out. So Florida State knows what the deal is. As for the Coastal Division, it's down to Virginia Tech and Duke, with Miami kind of falling out of the race. Virginia Tech plays against Duke in Week 13. That is a huge game with not just ACC divisional complications, but possibly seeding complications for the playoff, at-large bid discussion. So I think the winner of that game is a shoo-in to make the playoff, and the loser, who knows? So right now, there's really 4 teams in a good spot in this conference, and Florida State's right in the mix as well. So the ACC could have 4, maybe even 5 teams in the playoff. As for the Big Ten, I think they're slightly below the SEC and the ACC right now. Ohio State's in a good spot. They do have 2 pretty tough games left against Illinois and Michigan. If they don't lose out, I think they will probably get in. Illinois is a very fascinating team because they're 8-2. They still have to play Ohio State. I think Illinois has to win that game in order to get in. But if they do win that game, then all hell's going to kind of break loose. As for the Big Ten West, it really comes down to the winner of the USC and Notre Dame game. Oregon's in a really good spot because they have 2 easy games left. If they win those 2, they'll be 10-2. They don't have to worry about the conference championship, and they'll probably get an at-large bid. As for USC and Notre Dame, I think the loser of that game is pretty much out. So both of those teams have to win. The winner goes to the conference championship game probably. So that is a huge game in Week 14. As for the Big Ten as a whole, I think right now those top 4 teams are in a pretty good spot, particularly Ohio State and Oregon. And if Illinois beats the Buckeyes, then Illinois vaults themselves into that discussion as well. In the Big 12, it really looks like it's going to be Cincinnati and Baylor. They have built nice leads within their division. They've been the 2 best teams in the conference this year, so I think it'll be those 2 facing off in the conference championship game. I don't think either of them have strong enough resumes to get an at-large bid if they lose their conference championship, so I think we're only going to see 1 team out of the Big 12. In the Pac-12, Washington and Arizona play against each other in Week 13. The winner goes to the Pac-12 championship to face off against Cal. We went into detail about Cal a moment ago, how they've had a really fun story this year, and what the hell are they going to do at quarterback when Rufus Motley is back healthy. In the American, Middle Tennessee State did their job today. They beat South Florida and Memphis. They have 2 more, not easy games, but games they should win. And then in the West, I really think it'll be Texas Tech or South Alabama who plays against Middle Tennessee State in the conference championship. Tulsa leads for Conference USA by a lot. The MAC is a pretty fun race with Bowling Green leading the pack. Them and Akron, one of those 2 is going to win the East. They play against each other in Week 14. So the winner will go to the conference championship. And then in the MAC West, Toledo, Eastern Michigan, and Northern Illinois are all 4-3, so one of them will go as well. In the Mountain West, Idaho is 10-1. They are really good. And then in the Sun Belt, it's Texas State and Georgia State who had the edge over everybody else. So let's take a look at these next few weeks of games. And as I've been saying, Week 13 is probably the most important regular season week we have had in this entire series yet. So let's look at some of these big games. A lot of teams who have to win, like Notre Dame and USC. Virginia Tech, Duke, winner goes to the conference championship and likely cements their spot into the college football playoff. Illinois and Ohio State. Can Illinois keep their season alive and keep their chances of winning the Big Ten East alive as well? And then looking down even further, Georgia has to win against Kentucky. I guess South Carolina still has a slight shot, so I guess they have to win. Arizona and Washington, the winner goes to the Pac-12 championship. Miami's got to win to keep any semblance of hope alive. Clemson and Florida State is a huge game, particularly for Florida State, but for Clemson as well. They can't really afford a second loss. Texas has to win, and then the winner of Oklahoma and Alabama goes to the SEC championship. So Week 13 is just absolutely loaded with games. Week 14, there are some big ones as well. Notre Dame and USC atop the list. Texas Tech and South Alabama probably decides that division. Florida and Florida State's a really big game, particularly for the Seminoles, regardless if they beat Clemson or not. Florida State's really got to win that game against the Gators. Duke, Navy, teams like that, they still have to win. And then Week 15, the only teams of note playing are Navy in the Army-Navy game and Oklahoma in Bedlam against Oklahoma State. So that's going to wrap up the episode. I know that's a lot to take in, but, I mean, these races for the college football playoff are really getting exciting here. So next episode, I'm not sure what we're going to do. I'm seriously contemplating giving Week 13 its own episode. Let me know if you guys want to see that or if you would just rather me do 3 weeks like normal. So let me know that in the comments. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.